Hello, my name is David, and welcome to this channel where we talk about coding topics, web development, computer science, try to make interesting how-to videos, tutorials, and things of that nature. And this video is State Machine Part 2. If you haven't seen the Part 1, check that out. In Part 1, we talk about concepts of state machine, the paradigm shift of event-based paradigm on a web page and interacting with UI versus a event and then state paradigm. So this form right here that I'm going to use is actually taken from John Bella's article on Introduction to State Machines in JavaScript. He implements a similar solution that I'm going to implement, but his is using an old version of the library, so it actually no longer works. So I thought I'd just do the same thing, but adjust it to the new API of the library. And you can see here, we're basically going to create a payment form. It's going to have 4 states: idle, loading, success, and error. And if this doesn't look familiar, please take a look at State Machine Part 1 before moving on to Part 2. Now, State Machine Part 2, we're actually going to implement a state machine in React. And I'm using Code Sandbox for this demo. Code Sandbox is basically a Visual Studio Code in the browser. It also has a browser window to the right here that will update on any changes. And to the left is the text editor. So we don't have to create a new project for this. We could just start one in the browser, which is convenient. I'll post a link to this in the description so you can see the working example. So I have a basic setup here. In the index page, you can see that there's a payment form component. And all the styles are just in this global style sheet. And in the payment form component, you can see it's just a class component, and it's just returning some JSX right now. And there's no functionality built in. This is basically just a form right now, and we're going to implement state machine from here. So the first thing we want to do is, let's just add some comments. So we want to make a state machine with a couple different states. So we want a loading. Actually, let me see if I can zoom in here. There we go. Okay. Great. Okay, we want a loading state. Well, first we want the idle state, and then we want a loading, and the loading is either going to resolve to a success or an error. So to get this started, we need something to help us create this state machine. And so that's where the Xstate library comes in. And so if I come, let's see here. So I can add dependencies in Code Sandbox by just actually typing them in. So we're going to use Xstate. This was actually mentioned in the Part 1 video. And so you can see we added to our dependencies, and it will install that for us automatically, which is pretty awesome. All right, so we have Xstate installed in our project. And this is a library that is just going to help us manage the state machine. And so let's import that first. So we'll import machine from Xstate. All right, and you can see it actually will modify the, reformat the code when I push save, which is a great feature of Code Sandbox. Okay, so we have access to this machine, and this is how we create our machine. and the machine is actually just going to be a property on our class. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the initial state, or the initial machine, outside the class. And so we could actually import this from another file if we wanted to, but I'm just going to do it here. So in order to start your state machine and define the classes, define this different states, you use this machine function, and it just takes an object, which is going to be your state machine. So first I'll define the different states. And so you do that with the states key. And the states key is just an object of states. And states are just key value pairs, with the name being the value. The name being the key. So the first state is just going to be an idle state. And I could define where to transition on different events. So if you remember from the last video, states can accept events and then transition based off of those events. So in order to define the event, just use the on property. On key. I guess property is okay too. So here we go. We have our first state. The state is idle, and it's an object. And on the submit event, we'll transition to a loading state. So that means we need to add loading next. So loading is another state. It's an object. And what we'll do is, I'm just going to hold off on that for a second, because there's something I have to go into a little bit further. But I want to define all the states right now. So on error is our next state. And so if you're on error, that means you could try to submit the form again. So remember, the whole point of this is that we want to have a user enter their card information and submit the form. So there's only a couple states that this whole entire component could be in, and that's the idle one, which is what happens when you load. When I click pay now, it goes into a loading state, and the loading state will transition into an error if there's been an issue, or success, which will be the final state. So on error though, we'll have a chance to resubmit the form, so we can go back into loading. And so to define that functionality, error could accept another event, and the event will be on submit, and that will go back to our loading state. So pretty much the same exact thing as idle. And then there is success. And success is going to take this property called type, and it has a value called final. So once we get into our success state, we're done, and we can't transition anymore. And we tell it to do that by defining a type and final. Okay. So the other thing we have to do is we have to define an initial state. So when this first loads, what's the initial state? We could do that with this property called initial. And initial is going to be our idle state. All right, so this is our basic state. Now, I left this empty because this is a little more complicated. So with loading, loading is going to resolve to error and success. But usually what happens on a component like this is you click this button and it goes off and it sends the data to a server asynchronously, and we wait for it to resolve before doing something else. So in order to do that with a state machine, there's this property called invoke. And invoke is, you can think of it as invoking a service. So it's just a service that's defined as an inside this object in the loading state. So invoke will be called when the state gets transitioned into loading. So it takes a property called ID, and we'll name it do payment. And the source property is a function that's going to be executed. And this takes two parameters, context and event. And I'm just going to do an arrow function to keep this in line. Right, so this is what you would normally do. Once you push the button, you'll go into a loading state, and then you'll do the payment. So in order to do that, I have a fake payments function, and will return a promise, just like a normal asynchronous function or a call to a database. But instead, we're doing it ourselves. We're going to fake it. So it'll either return that the payment succeeded or the payment failed. And we're just going to do that by using math.random. And so if the dice comes back as 0, it'll be succeeded. Otherwise, we'll reject it and it'll hit error. All right, so to work with that, we're going to import it. And you notice we're not really passing any data to this right now. That's because I just want to build a basic state machine that transitions to different states. In order to pass data, that's like another level up in dealing with state machines. And we could possibly make a state machine part 3 for that. But we're just going to stick with this for now. So source is going to either resolve successfully or it's going to be rejected, so there'll be an error. And very handy, we have a onDone property, and that is also an object. So when we resolve successfully, we'll have a target, and target is going to be a name of a state. So if we resolve successfully, we'll hit this onDone property, and we'll transition to this success state. And on error is, you guessed it, going to transition to error. So this is how you do. This is how you're going to call a service in your state, in your state machine. So now we have the basic outline of our state machine, and you can see that the whole purpose of having a state machine is so that you could look at it, and anyone could look at it to understand what's going to happen on each state. So I could, just in one glance, I could say, okay, well, when this starts up, we're going to be in our idle state. And then on a submit event, we're going to go into our loading state. And during the transition of the loading state, when we finish the transition, we're going to invoke this service. And this function is going to be called. And it's going to resolve to onDone or on error. And if it resolves to success, that's going to be our final state. And then on error, we're going to transition to error. And will be in our error state. And the only thing that could happen on error is having another submit event, which will go back to our loading state. So that's kind of the genius behind having the state machine, is just being able to look at everything in one glance and knowing how this component is supposed to work. All right, so how do we actually use this now? Because this is just a variable. So this is what we're going to do. So Xstate comes with something called an interpreter, which will allow you to actually make this object useful. And so interpreter is, we actually have to import it. So interpret is a function that is going to return a service that will allow you to transition states. So what we'll do is we'll create a property on our class called service, and in order to create that, we're going to take our interpret and we're going to pass it the state machine that we created. Now, let's see what error this can over here. Okay, let's just keep going here, because I think this will resolve itself. Interpret also has, will give us access to this event on transition. Now on transition will take a function, which will be the current state. And I think what I want to do here is just log the current state for now. Just did current, yeah. Okay, what's happening here? Cannot retrieve initial state from simple state machine. Oh, sorry. So initial property is actually not on the states object. It's actually one level higher. Okay. So there we go. We imported interpret, which is going to return a service that lets us use this state machine. And the argument that it takes is a state machine. And we could chain an event onto that, which will basically, the event is called onTransition, and it takes a function which is going to be the current state that just got transitioned to. And so you could do something with that current state. And right now we're just going to log it so we could see what the current state is after it's been transitioned. And next what we want to do is, now that we have the service, we need to actually start the service. So I'm just going to use component did mount lifecycle hook. So once the component is mounted, I'm going to take our service and we'll start it. And while I'm here, on the component will unmount hook, we will stop our service to free up resources. So this prevents, I think what this will do is will prevent like memory leaks. It'll free up memory resources for when this component's no longer around. So the next thing we need to do now is somehow wire up this button to transition states. I'll wire up an event on this button. And so we have this event listener in React on click, and we're going to handle a submit. And so let me create that function now. So handle submit is a property on our class, and we're going to use this to handle our state transitions, basically. So you can see here, okay, so I'm using type button. If this was type submit, I would have to prevent default from submitting the form, but I'll just keep it type button. All right, handle submit. First, let's just do a console log to make sure this is all working correctly so far. And in Code Sandbox, they give you access to a console here. All right, it's working. Great. And what we'll do is we have access to this .service, and now I want to send the state machine an event. And the way that I do that is with a send function and the event name. So all this button is doing is just going to send submit events. That's it. And you can tell that that submit event correlates to this property here. So on the idle state, when the service gets sent a submit event, we'll transition to loading. On loading, this function will be called, will resolve to success or error. On success, we're done, and the state machine will not transition anymore. But on error, it's possible to get another submit event. So if I re-click this button, we're going to go back to loading and do it all over again. All right, so that is a basic state machine. It was pretty easy to set up, but it actually took me quite a long time to figure out the API behind Xstate and how to invoke the service. So there's so many things that you could do with this. And you can imagine, components can get really complicated with what they could do, and there could be child components that also need parts of the state. So Xstate is a pretty big library to learn, and it actually did take me quite a bit of time to even get this far. So let's just confirm that this is working right now. So you can see that this, I'll just refresh. So you guys know that this is showing correct data. So I just refreshed the app, and on load, which is going to be the first transition here, we're in the idle state. So you can see what the state looks like here. You can see that the value is the name of the state that we're currently on. So if we transition, so you can see we submitted, we took a payment. Take payment is happening on the fake payment function. And then we transitioned into loading. And you could see that it errored, so then we transitioned into error state here. Okay, so at this point, maybe the name on the card was incorrect, or something happened in the back end. So now we have an opportunity to submit again. So you could see that we're in this state, and on submit, we're going to go back into loading. So let's clear the console, and we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll get a success this time. Okay, we got error again. So you can see we're submitting, taking payment, loading, and then we got error. Let's try one more time. All right, we got error again. One more time. Okay, we got success. Hopefully your app doesn't get that many errors. Okay, so now we're on success, and you can see that this is type final. And what happens if we try to submit again? So you can see that we basically timed out of the service. The service kind of stopped at final. And so this is what's cool about a state machine, is that you don't have to necessarily handle or bugs will not arise because someone is pushing this button a bunch of times, because we are explicitly saying what our states are and what happens on each state and what events could happen on each state. So now that we've transitioned to final, we're no longer accepting this event submit. And that is part of the beauty of state machines. And that is all. That's all I wanted to show you for this video. This is a very simple state machine. There's so many more complex solutions. I recommend checking out Xstate. They have a lot of examples and different types of solutions for different types of state machines that you may want to build. All right, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. Please subscribe, comment, like. Let me know what kind of videos you want to see next. Hope this video was useful for you. Thanks a bunch. See you soon.